right, guys. Keep going. All right, but I want to make sure I have my person who can introduce us here and the author is here. Otherwise, it's sort of embarrassing if you get going and neither one is actually in the room. My name is Dwayne. I run the science fiction here. That's all we need to do about that. Thank you for coming. In case you guys haven't looked at the schedule, I have 3 more events the next 3 days. Rochelle Mead is here tomorrow, Curtis Chen and Jason up on Thursday, and Tad Williams on Friday. So if you're not like currently half dead students, you might wonder why I meet one of those people. Because some of them are worth talking to, at least. I won't say which ones. Beyond that, I'm going to introduce Edie from Clarion West. She's going to take him here. Please welcome Edie.
Anywhere for my props. So good evening. I just want to thank you all for joining us for the 2017 Clarion West Summer Reading Series. My name is Rashida, also known as Eddie, and I'm a member of the Clarion West Board of Directors. This is the 34th year of the annual Clarion West Writers Workshop. Our mission is to provide world-class educational opportunities to emerging writers of speculative fiction. The chance to showcase the work of amazing instructors like Kij is a big part of that opportunity. Thank you to the University Bookstore and Dwayne for partnering with us on these events. This series would not be possible without the generous support of the National Endowment of the Arts, Amazon.com, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, King County for Culture, the University Bookstore, the Seattle Public Library, and many individual donors. The readings continue through July 27th at the University Bookstore, with the exception of 2 readings on July 11th and July 18th, which will be held at the Downtown Library. Please note that because the University Bookstore will be closed on July 4th, John Chu's reading will be at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, July 5th. So if that's a lot to keep track of, do make sure that you pick up one of these yellow flyers or check www.clarionwest.com for the full schedule. Org, thank you. Okay, mistake number 1 out of the way. Here we go. The July 18th reading at the Downtown Library will start at 6 p.m. with an hour of original and DJ music by Gabriel Theodoros. Also, the Clarion West Writers Write-a-thon is officially underway. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year. So think of a walk-a-thon with words. If you're a writer and you're participating in the write-a-thon, can you raise your hand? So this year we have over 200 writers from all over the world signed up, and they've set their writing goals, and we're now recruiting sponsors to show your support by making donations to Clarion West. That sponsorship is really important. It's not just to Clarion West, but to the individual writers that you're supporting. If you didn't raise your hand, I encourage you to consider sponsoring one or more of these writers. Visit www.clarionwest.org to browse the writers' profiles, read excerpts from their work, and learn about their goals, and sponsor the writers or writers who you want to encourage. Last bit, thank you for your patience. Thanks again for your support. I'm going to, actually, quick thing. If you would like to know more about the sponsorship of the organization, you can sign up for our newsletter. We'll be sending out a flash fiction story at the end of the summer to everyone who signed up for the newsletter. So I will have a clipboard. I'll be walking around at the end of the workshop. I'll be smiling and I have pins in my hands. So if you want that free story, be sure to sign up. Now I'm going to invite Workshop Director Hugh Evans to tell you more about tonight's reading.
Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I got to introduce Kij last time she taught here back in 2014. I thought of just repeating everything I said. But instead, I'll skip all that and go on to more immediately relevant topics. So, topic number 1, the happy, inspiring stuff. Kij Johnson is here just 3 years after her first time teaching Clarion West. 3 years is about the minimum time we can schedule for a return, so this is evidence of how awesome a teacher she is. We couldn't wait to have her back. I've spent more time in workshops with Kij, either as a student or facilitating the workshops, than with any other writing instructor. And no matter what she's doing, whether she's dissecting novels, unearthing buried character motivations, discussing social implications of aesthetic choices, or jumping up and down with joy because she's got the best idea in the world and she's about to share it, I always learn something new and vital. In class this week, Kij is inciting the students to go farther. not just to be the good writers that they had to be to get into the workshop, but to sound the utter depths of their potential and to harness it all. Second, business. Kitsch has more books. In addition to novels, The Foxwoman and Fudoki, and her collection At the Mouth of the River of Bees, if you don't have those, you should buy them. There's the new Nebula, Shirley Jackson, Campbell, Locust, and Hugo-nominated novella, The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow. While yes, a response to H.P. Lovecraft's work of a similar title is also so much more and so much better. It's one of the most beautiful, immersive, transporting works I've read. And it's fun, exciting, suspenseful, inspiring, start to finish. So be sure to pick up a copy tonight, or better, several copies. Also, coming soon from Small Beer Press is The Riverbank. It is the perfect and oh so satisfying sequel to one of my all-time favorite imperfect books, Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows. I had the great pleasure of reading The Riverbank last year, and I can tell you it's brilliant. Pre-order a dozen copies now, and you'll have your holiday shopping all sorted. Third, requisite book jackety bio. Kitsch Johnson teaches creative writing at the University of Kansas and is associate director of the Gunn Center for the Study of Science Fiction, where she teaches an intensive novel writing workshop. I just attended, and it is fantastic. She is also a frequent teacher at Clarion, Clarion West, and many other workshops, and she's a judge for the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award. She's one of the finest writers alive, or dead, and I'm super excited to hear her read from The Riverbank tonight. Please join me in welcoming a superhero of science fiction and fantasy, Kitsch Johnson.
After that, so, all right, let's see if we can do this. Is this working? All right. All right, well, we'll hope that works then. Yes, this is a sequel to The Wind in the Willows. I had the same problem with The Wind in the Willows that I had with The Dream Quest of Unknown Cadet by H.P. Lovecraft, which was that there are no females. And I got to thinking a few years back about fictions and why they choose not to have females specifically, why they choose to sort of disenfranchise anybody. And as an experiment, I started trying to write things. And I say that, and it sounds like it was an intellectual decision, but in fact, I basically just wrote this for my friend Elizabeth, who is in the audience. I wrote her a scene a day, and it was the greatest pleasure I have ever had with a computer in my life. And that even counts when I was surfing German Shepherd pictures. So the book was supposed to be out in May, and I got an email from Gavin, the publisher, in January saying, I'm not going to lie, the Trump election threw everything into chaos and anarchy here. I didn't get anything done, so can we reschedule to September? And I said, well, yes. Thanks, Trump. And so what I want to read here, this will be out in September, although it'll be sort of trickling out in availability in August. I want to read the scene where my two young ladies are introduced to the neighborhood. They are Beryl, who is nobody knows quite how everybody knows her name, but she is a young mole lady, who is a little bit mysterious, and her companion, the rabbit. Rabbits, by the way, everybody knows, are flighty. This is chapter 2. And depending on the timing, I'll read chapter 2. I may read chapter 3, which is sort of my response to the pretty chapters in Wind in the Willows. We'll see if we have time. Tea at Toad Hall. The weather remained fine for the Toads' tea party, and so it was that the mole, the water rat, their friend the otter, and the badger were all standing together on Toad Hall's southern terrace wearing clean collars, everyone with his fur brushed until it glowed. Even the badger had left behind his comfortable tweed hacking jacket with the patches on the elbows and its sagging pockets full of pipe supplies and pen knives and other interesting objects, and had donned instead an ancient, beautifully cut but somewhat worn morning coat and trousers. He was turning the tall hat around in his paws by the brim, exchanging pleasantries with their host, the toad. Waiting for females, typical, the mole groused to the rat, but softly, so that the others might not overhear. He scuffed a paw across the golden flagstones. This is precisely the sort of disruption I feared. Tight collars and every button buttoned and all that. When we could be halfway to the pike pond, just messing about or getting out the things for lawn bowling or and most anything but this. But the rat only chuckled and shook his head. Just wait until the eating starts and you will forgive everything. A few yards away, there were several small tables set with the snowiest linen and an immense sideboard brought out from the dining room so that the staff could hand things around in the most expeditious fashion, crowded intriguingly with trays, plates, salvers, cake stands, pitchers, and jugs, all covered with lace-edged napkins. He went on, "No, I shouldn't mind being back in my old flannel bags, but this isn't so bad." "As long as that's all it is," began the mole in a low voice. "You know Toad, Ratty. I shouldn't be surprised if he proved as susceptible to the attractions of young ladies as he is to motor cars, caravans, and the like. It starts with tea, but it could end anywhere at all, and I wouldn't dress up and stand around like this more than once, not for all the tea and cakes in the world." But the toad caught his last words and only said with a laugh, "Oh, Mole, don't be such a grouch. You look very dapper indeed. You all do. And it's worth everything just to see old Badger here in his finery. Very swank. Anyway, we are much too rustic here at the riverbank, I always say. We could all use some town bronze. Well, nearly all of us." The toad ran a paw lovingly down his lapel. He was quite glorious, shining in the sunlight in a white jacket of shockingly modern cut, short where it should be long, and narrow where it should be broad. It could not be said to flatter his figure, which was rather round than otherwise, but it was incontestably le dernier cri, or it might be anyway. None of the other animals had ever seen anything like it. The badger shook his head. "Toad, it is one thing for you to dress like this. You are rich and a known eccentric." The toad puffed up a bit, taking it for a compliment. "Though what your father would have said about such a coat I shall not speculate. But for you to encourage decent, proper fellows like the mole here to imitate such a mode." "They're here!" the otter exclaimed suddenly in a low voice, and the animals all turned. Indeed they were. Beryl and the rabbit were being led around to the corner of the house, Beryl behaving very properly, her attention directed towards her host and expressing no more than the appropriate amount of pleasant anticipation. But the rabbit, staring all about her, her eyes enormous in her pretty round face, and her ears twitching every which way. As they approached, she leaned close to whisper something into Beryl's ear while she gestured with one paw to the lawn leading down to the water's edge, a lawn large enough for any number of croquet games. The toad swelled visibly and was heard by the mole to murmur to himself, quite overcome, poor thing. And then in a louder voice, "Ladies, dear, dear ladies, you honor me. Welcome to my humble little patch of earth." He approached and bowed, seizing and kissing Beryl's paw with great elan and an expression so self-congratulatory and complacent that the badger made an untranslatable noise in his throat, and the otter was taken with a sudden fit of coughing. Presumably a gnat had flown into his mouth and had to turn away for a moment. The water rat and the mole exchanged looks. "Oh dear," whispered the water rat. "It's going to be like that, is it?" The situation was, in fact, not quite what they had feared. Toad's conceit would never permit him to fall in love at first sight or any other sight with any person than himself. But nevertheless, in all the ways that mattered, it was exactly like that. "Dear ladies," again said the toad, again bowing, "you are indeed welcome. We were just chatting, my friends and I, about how we chaps have grown far too casual here in the neighborhood, with no young ladies to incite or inspire, rather, those small acts of courtesy that have such a civilizing influence here in the country that we, But he had lost himself in his sentence and trailed off to a halt, looking a little silly. "Oh, too kind," interpolated the rabbit in suffocated tones, but Beryl only nodded and said very properly, It was kind of you to invite us. Thank you so much." Her voice was low and calm, but was there perhaps a gleam of amusement in it? She surely wasn't laughing at them. The mole, watching her pretty closely, could not be sure, but had his suspicions. "Oh, but you do not know my friends," the toad exclaimed pompously. "Allow me to introduce the badger to you, a very respected member of one of our older families. The water rat, a very pleasant chap. The otter, quite the gentleman. And," he said with great smugness, just as though he were selecting the correct ace from a deck of cards as part of a magic trick, "my dear, dear friend, the mole. Miss Mole and Miss Rabbit," he said to them all. "How do you do?" said everyone except the mole, who mumbled something or other. Beryl added with what might have been a deepening of the glimmer of a smile, if anyone had been certain whether she was smiling in the first place, said, "Mr. Mole and I have met before this, though perhaps he does not recollect the occasion." "You have?" exclaimed several voices at once, and various faces turned towards the mole. But before anyone could inquire further, Beryl turned to the toad and said, "What a charming place this is. You must tell us all about it." And that was the end of that topic, for the moment at least. Toad never needed much of an excuse to boast, and this was too fertile an opportunity to miss. Two strangers who very likely could be counted upon not to interrupt him with the sorts of statements his friends were too apt to make. Things like, "Don't be an ass, Toad," and "Do stop bragging, old chap," and "What your father would say, I don't know." The subsequent tour of the house and grounds was exhaustive. Seconded good-naturedly by the otter, the toad boasted his way through all the major rooms and offices, his words punctuated by oohs and oh my's from the rabbit, and less satisfyingly by Beryl's more restrained but also more rational compliments on such unexceptionable topics as the elegant proportions of the rooms. The rabbit was especially entranced by the green room, designed by the toad's grandfather as a sitting room to set off his new wife's complexion. "So romantic," she moaned, "just like a fairy tale. The prince wins his bride." "Rabbit," said Beryl in a tone that suggested to the suspicious mole the rolling of eyes. But the toad had heard nothing of this, and explained that it had just been restored at immense expense. He was prepared to tell them precisely how much, but was headed off from this by the badger, after a pack of low weasels and stoats had destroyed it. He added, "If you are interested at all in our little fracas last year, you may find the next room of even greater interest," and threw open a pair of doors. It was a large room, an impressive room, what was called the library, and had actually been used as such by the toad's father and grandfather before him, but now it had been turned into a sort of museum. The books had been shoved into the less visible nooks and corners of the room, and the most prominent shelves were crowded with bits of rubble, labeled things like "A piece of the canopy from the Queen Anne bedroom excavated by the toad," and "Unidentified shirt from the butler's pantry, found by the toad." There were as well weapons of every size and sort. Swords, daggers, cutlasses, cudgels, staffs, and sticks. Over the mantel, the toad had caused to be mounted a tasteful arrangement of crossed swords and pistols, clustered appetizingly on either side of a large painting in a gilded rococo frame of a mighty toad brandishing pistols in each hand, vanquishing quite a crowd of weasels, stoats, and foxes, as a rather smaller badger, mole, and water rat looked on admiringly from the corners of the picture. There was some sort of a thunderstorm going on in the background, and a bit of sunlight breaking through managed to illuminate the toad while leaving everything else in gloom. A small brass plate affixed to the frame read, "The valiant toad amidst the fray." "What?" said the badger, turning suddenly upon the hapless toad. "What is this atrocity?" "Oh, Well, as to that, said the toad with a careless gesture towards the mantel, I thought you might not have seen this yet. I have only just finished putting the room back together. I had someone down from town throw it together, a very up-and-coming young man, pictures in the Academy exhibition and all that. I think he captured your dignity, your real nobility of expression, don't you? He added in a weaker voice. Toad had been rather dreading this disclosure, and had hoped that the presence of such strangers as Miss Mole and the rabbit, females too, might mitigate to some degree the badger's anticipated reaction, unsuccessfully as it was turning out. Toad, said the water rat sternly, this is appalling. What happened to the better, more modest toad who made so many promises to us all last year? The toad who would not aggrandize himself, the contrite toad who freely acknowledged his faults and strove to amend his behavior? The toad said with a surprised expression, was I supposed to remain that way? Toad really writes himself, said the badger severely. And it is worse than that. Toad, it is one thing for you to act foolish to us. We may be disappointed, but we are not at least surprised. But you have been lying to an artist. The valiant Toad. I only hope you paid him well for this debasement of his craft. He held up his paws. The toad opened his mouth. No, I do not wish to know how well you paid. This all must be removed immediately and the room returned to what it was. Quite right, nodded the water rat. Really, Toad, what were you thinking? But the rabbit exclaimed, oh no, Mr. Badger, do not say so. Such an exciting event and everyone so courageous. It should be memorialized. She pressed her paws together. I am agog. Why, you are all heroes. Well, as to that, the toad said modestly, but with one wary eye on the badger, I did not do so very much. It was these three that saved the day, you know. But I did do quite a lot of fighting, yes, he continued, perking up. Quite mowed them down, you might say. Perhaps the ladies would like to repair to the tea tables. I am sure the lemonade shall be getting warm. The lemonade was not warm, a tribute to the toad's competent household staff, and they all fell to with a will. Toad Hall had always been famed for the excellence of its kitchens, bakery, and cellar, and in this at least the toad had proved himself the equal of his father, and even of his grandfather, who had, skipped a page, been famed throughout the county for his hospitality. There was Indian tea, and Ceylonese tea, and Chinese tea. There was lemonade, and raspberry juice, and champagne, and claret, and beer, the last for the water rat, but served in a goblet, so as not to seem low. There were charming little sandwiches, some filled with watercress, and others filled with pink shavings of ham, and yet others with a delicious orange paste that tasted of curry and chicken, and scones and cakes, and, well, there was a lot of it, and it was all very good. And that is all I can say about that, without going on for pages and pages, and leaving you all very dissatisfied with your own teas. At his small table, Toad had seated the young ladies to either hand in the easy-going otter with them. The mole, the rat, and the badger were at his second table close beside the first, and thus, separated from his most usual critics, the water rat and the badger, the toad absolutely let himself go. Well, it was no great matter, said the toad in a self-effacing tone, when the rabbit asked him to tell her more about the attack upon Toad Hall. He cocked one eye at the badger to see whether he were listening, but that worthy beast was in close conversation with the water rat and the mole, and evidently paying no heed. And as for the otter, he was gazing at the toad with affectionate interest and no apparent intention of queering the game. I was away from home for some time on business, you know, and returned to find that in my absence the place had been overrun by wild wooders. So I organized my friends, armed everyone, and off we went. There were hundreds of them, and oh, it was a battle. Hours of combat. Weasels tossed from the windows, stoats cast into the river, ferrets weltering in their own gore. And who was it that did all this? Only Toad. A slash to the left, a fox falls, thanks to Toad. A blow to the right, down goes a cat. Toad again. A fierce capybara escaped from the zoo. What now? Toad saves us all. Here, a badger finds himself cornered by a score of villainous weasels. What to do? What to do? A toad to the rescue. There, a water rat weeping. Toad. The badger's thundering voice from the other table caused the toad to drop his butter knife, which he had been brandishing, in a manner that boded ill for the rabbit's whiskers, for she was leaning forward as far as she could, her eyes shining. What bragging lies are you telling? Lies? The toad exclaimed with an affronted expression. Badger, I am only telling them a bit of the history of last year's events. I have not forgotten, though you may have, that I have learnt my lesson, though I may have gotten carried away a bit just at the end, he admitted. No, Toad, it was all mere fabrication, beginning to end. The badger leaned across to Beryl. Toad was not away on business at all. In fact, he was, no, said the toad weakly. The ladies don't need in prison for motor car stealing. Madam, if you are to stay here, it is best that you know what sort of people your neighbors are. Motor cars, Beryl said, though she sounded more amused than distressed. Dear me, that is very bad. But perhaps it will not be such a great issue for the rabbit and myself, as we do not have a motor car. More tea, Mr. Ball. And horse stealing, said the water rat, adding his mite. And impersonating a washerwoman, and defrauding the rails, and horse stealing. Or did I say that already? You did, said Beryl. You did, affirmed the mole. And there was a second motor car theft, was there not? I cannot keep track. Oh, how thrilling, said the rabbit, her ribbons fluttering with excitement. It is all exactly like the ancient Greeks. Ulysses. Ulysses, Beryl said dryly, very likely. Oh, Beryl. The rabbit looked reproachfully at her companion. It was all just a misunderstanding, explained the toad to the rabbit, taking little heed of Beryl, as he knew no Greeks, ancient or otherwise, except for owning a very old vase covered with any number of them, all inadequately clad. All most unfortunate, but there was no harm done. I escaped with no aid whatsoever, charmed the jailer's daughter, tricked a railroad engine driver, ho, fooled an old canal woman, and stole her horse, and sold it to great advantage. Sweet-talked a fine breakfast from a gypsy, quite one of my brethren of the road, and a very good chap. Very like Ulysses, said Beryl, more dryly still. The mole opened his mouth as though to say something, but shut it again abruptly. The toad continued unheeding, and stole again the very motorcycle that had started the whole thing. Could anyone else have done this? No, only Toad. He suddenly noticed every eye on him, the rabbits round with wonder, but the rest expressing skepticism, amusement, and annoyance compounded in various proportions. He ended in a more rational tone. Anyway, all's well that ends well, I always say, and here I am, an entirely reformed toad. All was not well, interjected the water rat, except for the barristers you had to pay and the exchequer you sent the fines to. They ended up well enough, he said with a grin. But the rabbit did not care. This toad, this courageous, gay, glorious toad, seemed to her a sort of beau ideal, precisely the sort of fellow a young animal might esteem and even strive to emulate. She exclaimed, "You are so very resourceful." Not at all, the toad said. You seem a rabbit of intrepidity. I am sure you have had adventures of your own. Oh no, nothing to compare, the rabbit said with envy. I have only been in a hot air balloon ascent, and there was that time I became involved in a bank robbery. But they were very nearly accidents. She sounded regretful. Dear Lottie, said Beryl warningly, in a tone most of those present recognized, having used it themselves many times with the toad. I am sure the gentlemen do not care about our doings. It was clear that by her intonation of the word our, Beryl meant your. But the toad patted the rabbit's hand patronizingly. You have not, of course, had the same opportunities as I. Perhaps another time I will share with you a few of my adventures when I traveled across England in a caravan. The water rat said rudely, "You mean crashing it in a ditch within a few miles of home?" This was all quite wearing to an animal of sense. "A caravan," the rabbit cried, unheeding. "Of all the things, the activity I wish most to try." "Indeed," said the toad, "it was the neatest thing. I quite loved my caravan, so compact, everything in its place, the open road before one. Indeed, I thought it was the only thing until I began motoring." "Motoring?" the rabbit gasped and clasped her paws together. "So you did not merely steal a motor car? Perhaps you even owned one?" The toad bowed, one eye on the glowering badger, whose expression was darkening by the minute, rather like a summer cloud just before the first thunderclap that presages the deluge. "Before I became the quiet, mannerly animal you see before you, I was indeed a motorist, the fastest, most dangerous, riskiest motorist that ever was. Before I reformed, that is," he added hastily. But even the mole had at last had enough. The badger was speechless because he could not select which of the many hot words upon the tip of his tongue he wished first to say, and the otter, most reprehensibly, was struggling not to laugh. The mole whispered to the gaping water rat, "Cannot anyone stop that rabbit? Toad is bad enough without encouragement. She's absolutely inciting him, and you know where that will end." "I do indeed." The water rat eyed the toad, who was visibly expanding under the rabbit's admiring eye. "It will end as toad's exploits always end, with a wreck of some sort and then constables." "No, you are right. We must stop this." And when a moment came in the toad's perorations into which he could interject a word, he said more loudly, "Toady, perhaps the young ladies would like to see the lime alley before they leave." So I think that I'm going to read you something that's very different in flavor. It's just a moment, and I'm reading this. This is my Piper at the Gates of Dawn thing. So I have to find it for you. Water Lilies is it's part of the chapter called Water Lilies. And all you have to know at this point is that bad things have been happening, and several of the members of the group are gone at the moment. So Beryl is still around, and because they are worried for friends, but it is not, as we know from the Graham books, the animals don't worry when bad things happen, they move on. But my exact sentence is, they were worried for their friends, but they were also animals, even if charmingly dressed property-owning animals. Water Rat is going to go for a skull, and Beryl has never been on the water, and so he invites her. And he's going to pick her up in 20 minutes, or 10 minutes. It was more than 10 minutes, for the water rat had to clean up his boat a bit. As a bachelor, he did not always keep things quite as neat as a lady might like. And then there were a few boat cushions to be wiped clean and tossed into the bow for her comfort. But it was still less than 20 before he tied the painter to the cottage dock. Beryl was waiting and quickly handed down the basket. It was satisfyingly heavy, and her parasol, and then hopped down into the boat herself, causing it to rock a bit before she settled herself into the bow. "Where to?" asked the water rat amiably. "Just the other day I was up the river, upon a bicycle," she exclaimed. "So down, perhaps? To the weir, you said, or will rowing back be too much labor?" "Labor," said the water rat as he dug in with the oars and took them into the current. "No, indeed. We are only going out for an hour or two, after all. Hardly time to tire ourselves out. A nice row back in the coolness of the evening, while it will be just what we need after we empty that basket of yours." Oh, the river. The water rat sculled them across to the other bank, and they dawdled their way downstream from there, peering into every inlet and lagoon. They chatted a bit in soft voices of this and that, but Beryl had the rare gift of silence, and much more of the time they said nothing. The water rat, she's, by the way, spoiler, she's a novelist. She writes novels every morning from 9 until noon, and then she edits after tea. The water rat was not to know that the silences were not hers to control. She had completed the morning's labors, but the novel was still talking to her, endlessly, demanding she notice the osiers, their smell like wood or reeds, perhaps, or even, if it could be phrased properly, nothing but themselves. The ducks dabbling in a little backwater, tails up, bright yellow legs paddling the air, charming and easy to describe, but to what end? And there was a willow bowed down so far that when she and the water rat floated through its drooping wands, they found themselves in a shimmering chapel made of long silver leaves that whispered in the tiny breeze. Could this be used in some fashion? And there was the river itself, the changing, dancing water, the reflection of sunlight that now revealed the duckweed that raved below the surface, a trout shining with 1,000 rainbows suspended as though in crystal until it flicked its tail and was gone into the shadow of the bank. The sound of the water against the boat's hull, like the bars of a rosewood xylophone brushed with a velvet mallet. Chuk, chingle, a sweet, rippling, chiming sound. But no, there were no words. The novel and the river confronted one another in Beryl, and this time, in this manner, the river triumphed in that it permitted no words for itself, and the novel acknowledged defeat and let Beryl be for a while. Down Beryl and the water rat floated until they came at last to a place where the river divided itself to pass on either side of a small tangled island, and where stretched across both branches wood and wire, and a rippling of the water the only signs of where they were from upstream. "There," said Beryl, "the island. Let's stop there for a while." "If you think so," said the water rat. She heard a certain wariness in his tone. "Do you think it is dangerous to stop so close to the wires?" "If you mean, can I row us away when we are done, of course I can," said the water rat, a little crossly, then added more thoughtfully, "It's not the wires, but the island. We animals don't go here, that's all. It's dangerous." "It is, but I can't tell you how exactly. Not dangerous to your life, but something else. Why can't I remember? Otter, you know Otter. His son Portly got lost there last year it was. We found him, but it's so quiet, you see," he finished lamely. "So are we quiet," said Beryl. "There, that little inlet. It will be all right, I think. And even if it's not, Rat, I feel as though I must go there, no matter what happens. Can you understand that?" And he could, though he could not remember why. Silently he rowed them into the inlet, which was narrow as a stream, hung over by rushes bent nearly to the water. She knelt in the bow and pushed them aside with her paws as they advanced, but it was only a few yards before the water opened out into a little lagoon bounded with waist-high reeds, trees towering to meet overhead so that the sunlight came through in patches. The water was hidden by the green discs and white wheels of lilies, so many lilies, laid over and across one another until the water showed only in tiny black scraps. The space was utterly still, except for flecks of buzzing light that were insects hovering above the lilies, caught for a moment in the shafts of sunlight. The water rat raised his oars, and they glided silently until they came to rest amid the water lilies. Beryl leaned over the boat's side and touched them, one by one. She plucked one, and it came free with a little splash. Its long, bright green stem and white petals glowed against her dark skirt. At its heart was a cluster of yellow stamens. A single dragonfly, red as enamel, had been resting upon it. It lifted and vanished in a soundless movement, a curving line across the air that shone for a moment in their eyes. On one side was a little grassy bank that came down to the very edge of the lagoon. They could see the short grass went under the water a little way, as though the water was not always this high. Wordlessly, the water rat grounded his boat upon the bank, and Beryl stepped out in a daze, unmindful of the water that came to her ankles. "I can't leave the boat," said the water rat, and his simple voice was softened, muted by the lilies and their pads. "There's nothing to tie it to." Beryl nodded. "I shan't be a moment," she said, as though this were the most normal thing anyone could do, walk alone and without explanation into the little wilderness that rose all around them. She stepped up the bank to a clump of loosestrife and passed beyond it. For a moment, he could still see the white lily in her paw against the shady undergrowth, and then that too was lost to the water rat's sight. The water rat waited in the still lagoon and looked at the lilies. The air was still and sleepy. He loved water lilies as he loved everything about the river, though they were laborious to scull through, and usually there was no point to doing so, for lilies collected in still places, dead ends, places that led from nowhere to nowhere. The paths were not quite perfect circles, each a tiny field with a slim green fence, and the lilies rose among them like trees, opened, half-opened, and buds. The rat was a poet, and had once tried to write a poem about them. He had compared the lilies to stars in the sky, and rhymed white with light and sprite, but the words had dried upon his pen, and he had set that poem aside in a cubbyhole of his desk, and never returned to it. But he could still look on them with pleasure, and so he did so, and waited dreamily. And after a time, Beryl returned. There was a quickness to her steps now, and her eyes were bright. The lily that had been in her hands was gone. "Rat," she said, and her voice was light and sweet, very unlike her normal low, calm tones. "Oh, I have seen him." The water rat straightened. Had he been napping? "Seen who?" he said ungrammatically. "Him. Oh, Rat, you did not say that. He was here. Can you hear them? Even now, his pipes, there, listen. You are right. Oh, he is dangerous, yes, but not to us animals. Surely not." Her eyes shone. "He spoke to me, and I worshipped at his feet. Have not you?" It came to the rat. For one perfect instant, the memory full and complete and free of loss or regret of that blessed night last summer when he and the mole had walked across the island and seen him, the protector of small animals. His kind wild eyes and human face, the wooden pipes in his long brown fingers, the curved horns that sprang from his forehead, his goat's legs, fine and strong and glossy brown, and little Portly the otter between his hooves, asleep within earshot of the deadly weir. "Yes," said the water rat. "Yes!" And it all made sense in that instant, for writing was a sort of divine madness, and who better to see the god of divine madness than one who wrote? He, the water rat, was a poet, and he knew he saw more than dear mole or the badger or the otter, or toad, bless his heart, but Beryl, he knew now, was one of his own, adopted child of the god, never to be free of his regard. She would never have a day that she did not see something and hear a voice in her mind say, "Remember this, and then write this." And he realized suddenly that he had no wish to take on that burden. He could write or not write. Days or weeks could pass by without him setting pen to paper or even thinking of poetry. He, if he chose, could mess about with rhymes as someone else might with boats. A passion, but one that could be set aside or ignored. As though he had closed a book, the memory slipped away. "Miss Mole," he said kindly, for she was staring into the air as though listening to something, but the space around the lilies was silent, quite silent. "Beryl, come into the boat." And she did. They said little on the long row back. It was hard, in spite of the water rat's words earlier, but he welcomed the labor. The day was nearly faded. How had they spent so much time on the river? But they had not started in the morning, that must be it. And gnats rose up in clouds that stained the air. Beryl said aloud, "I shall have to rewrite most of it. I see the problem now." He knew she was not speaking to him and said nothing. It was nearly dark when he let her off at last on the cottage's dock, and she smiled down at him in the dimming light. "Thank you, Rat, for a lovely day." "Thank you, Miss Mole," he replied, and after a moment's pause, he considered his next words. "May I ask—" But she was gone already, running up the lawn to the cottage, to the novel, and the changes that had become so clear to her on the island between the weirs. It was downstream from her cottage to his own comfortable hole, so he floated down, content to be the water rat, to have spent the day with his river. But those lilies now, they really were worth writing about. When he got home, he might dig out that old poem and try again, or perhaps not. For as he approached the bank by his hole, the mole was waiting for him and ran down to catch the painter and tie the boat up. "Was it a good day?" said the mole shyly as the water rat handed up the cushions. "I want to apologize for being so surly earlier. I should have gone." "Well, as to that," began the water rat and then stopped. In the bow was Beryl's little basket. "Why, we forgot all about the seed cake and sandwiches. Where did the time go?" Thank you. I know that the registers close like pretty much pronto, so if you have not bought books and wish to, now would be a really good time to rush over there. But I am also happy to answer a few questions if people have any. Somebody always has a question. Yeah.
Well, give us an idea about how classes go, without giving away any spoilers to the students.
Good evening, shoppers. The time is now 7:50 and the university bookstore will be closing in 10 minutes.
They say
Please
that.
be in making your final
They say
selection.
that. I'll answer really, really fast. It's an utterly fantastic class. I really, really am loving it. And they are very talented and very hardworking and very fun.
Any questions? What do you really-
Well, we've been, so you see what I did there, guys. Pay it forward when it's your turn. We've been talking about a lot of different things because it's week 2. So in week 1, a lot of sort of ground is covered, but what I'm trying to do is mostly talk about, just like there's a lot of stuff that I have like a 5-minute rant on, and I'm trying to give them all the rants. So in order. But one of the things I really want everybody to be thinking about is that competent storytelling does not necessarily, that's not enough yet. Good storytelling is fine, but what you need is actually something underneath it. You need like a fire inside of the story, whatever that looks like. And we've been talking, we haven't put it quite that way in class, so tomorrow I'll say it that way. So it's one of those things where he asks me and I'm going to be like, yes, that's what we're talking about. Of course, we're talking about all the really important stuff, aren't we, guys?
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, what's your process for really fine-tuning the animal point of view that you do so well in
I love animal points of view, I read a lot of animal behaviorism. So while I somewhat am restricted by what Graham has done with his surly badger and so forth, I also ended up reading books about all of these animals and what moles are like, and you know what we can tell about what animals are like. But mostly when I was little, I never wanted to be human, so I tried really hard not to be. And as I got older, my research practices got better, so when I was little, they consisted of walking around on all fours until my parents got tired of me. So, my cat, I would say. They're like, you just said the words. I'm like, oh, meow. Damn it, curse, I caught you. One day I'll get this right. But so I mean the answer is a combination of research and extrapolative thinking. That's the TLDR. Any other? No, yeah. I have 2 more then. Hi.
Hi. I know you said this at the beginning, but when is that book coming out?
September 2017 says the writing in the front. The little black bar will not be part of this. It's being published with a little colored cover, like a children's book, like the one that we all grew up with. So it's going to be a hardcover, like a fabric printed hardcover. And what you can't see is that it is full of little images. which are unbelievably cute. And you, of course, cannot see it, but when we are at Toad Hall, there is a picture of a stout toad with wings carrying a bow as a statue. And actually an important plot point is what his bed looks like. So he has a globe surmounted by a winged toad at the top of his fancy bed, which turns out to be a plot point. I'm kind of proud of that. Did I mention? Did you have a question?
Oh, I made a comment to him that last year Stephen Graham Jones was talking about how he would see himself as a werewolf and kind of so as soon as you were talking about or try to figure out how to be a werewolf. So you having a similar kind of at least animal path, I thought was an interesting.
I think a lot
so
about
was it comment,
anatomy. Yeah.
But it was also a question.
Yeah.
Like, would that be a collaboration, perhaps?
Yeah. Oh my God, that would be so cool. Yeah, it's it all started when I started trying to figure out the anatomy, because it's like where the elbows and knees are on the animals are not where ours are.
Yeah.
So if you want to write about animals, you have to think through where everything sets, so that you know what it feels like to run. You can't visualize running by saying, okay, here's what it would be like for me, even me on all fours. You have to think through, here's how it would feel to run if, this joint is up here and this joint is embedded in my belly flesh, and then this is my leg, this whole thing. And the more vividly you can visualize that, the more you're going to understand how an animal moves. And you can do that with everything, like how you eat. If you have pointy teeth, you eat differently than if you have blunt teeth. And if you gave the same food to a cow, if you could do that, a cow and a dog, they have different techniques for getting into their food. Although how you would talk your cow into, or your dog for that matter. Dogs will eat anything, that's right. That's true. One more question maybe, and then I'll sign anything if people have signings. Good. Okay. Well, okay.
Are you able and willing to talk about what you're working on now? Or
I am weirdly in between projects. I am finishing up the post-apocalyptic wasteland talking chicken with 6-year-old walking across post-apocalyptic wasteland story where we meet velociraptors. So set in 12th century England. So I mean, it's jammed for somebody, right? Me maybe, but nobody else. But I'm just finishing that up. I've got 2 other very short stories I want to finish. One is the oddest commission I've ever received to write a story for somebody's wedding. And I know, it's like, so that won't be spar anyway. I can read that for fun later if they want. So right now I'm between projects, and I have like sequels in mind for everything I have written for the last 20 years. Because sequels are easy, but I'm not sure what the next project is. So I'm going to have a decision made by September what I'm going to do next. Whether it's going to be like high literary mainstream thing, or whether it's going to be I am strongly tempted by the financial bankers from Fairyland novel called Sophie Gladstone and the First Bank of Fairy, which I have the one true reader for that, and I'm pretty sure that she would like give me all her money if I wrote it. Barbara. One of these days, Barbara. So right now I'm between projects, which is kind of a strange place for me because I went through 3 years where I wrote 3 books, boom, 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 and that's very unusual for me. All right, thank you guys so much for coming. That is a big light. Yeah. How are you? Well,
And you do a good